I'm going to be reading chapter 6 from Kaja Silverman's book, The Subject of Semiotics, the chapter titled Rewriting the Classic Text, which will be using elements of this for both the second blog concerning close reading and genre, and the third blog concerning intertextuality. There's a group of codes that will be introduced in this chapter. Think of a code as like a way of reading something that without the code is inaccessible. So that's what we're going to sort of be employing, is consciously, intentionally projecting a certain set of codes to help us reveal something at work in a text. As I read this, will provide some explanatory comments to make sure that some of the more difficult words and sentences might become clearer for you. She starts with a summary. In the two preceding chapters, we have focused a good deal of attention upon discourse, that is, think of language in action. A novel is a discourse, as the agency whereby the subject is produced and the existing cultural order is sustained. So, in other words, that a given text calls into being a certain role that you must play in order to get the text. And we'll talk about this in especially the fourth blog, The Rhetoric of Narrative. But at the same time that a reader becomes a subject of a given text, it also puts into play the entire cultural background that must be reinforced if the subject is to perform the role that the text asks you to play. So she also says, we have also spoken at length there about the central role played by sexual difference in the organization of all three. In short, we have tried to demonstrate the imbrication, that is, the sort of interweaving of subject, discourse, and symbolic order. Those are the three elements. Who you are as a reader of the text, that the text wants you to be, the text as discourse, and then the symbolic order that is reinforced by you assuming a role that the text wants you to play. However, the emphasis has fallen more consistently upon the first two of these categories than it has upon the last. So in other words, up until now, Kaja Silverman has been talking about the subject and discourse, but not so much the symbolic order. This chapter will address a theoretical model which is calculated to introduce the symbolic order more fully into our treatment of subjectivity and discursivity, that provided by Roland Barthes in SZ. That's a book that Roland Barthes wrote concerning how to read a book by Balzac called Sarrasine. Although SZ is generally considered to be a study of prose narrative, we will discover that its most remarkable achievement is to have articulated an interpretive strategy which permits the reader or viewer to uncover the symbolic field inhabited by a given text, and to disclose the oppositions, sexual and other, which structure that field. Despite the fact that SZ moves its argument forward through the segmentation of a short story by Balzac, Sarrasine, it is less concerned with those features which are specific to prose narrative than it is with a group of codes which can be activated by a number of textual systems: prose narrative, lyric poetry, epic poetry, narrative film, drama, comic strips, etc. These codes manifest themselves through connotation. As we observed in chapter 1, connotation, also think, by the way, for connotation, think of projection. So as we observed in chapter 1, connotation has always been an important element within Barthes' semiotics. In Mythologies, where he treats the issue most exhaustively, Barthes defines connotation as a secondary operation, one which builds on denotation. Again, denotation is the exact meaning of something. Connotation is associations, projections, stereotypes that sort of emerge beyond just strict denotation. In other words, he has recourse to the Helmslivian paradigm, in which the entire denotative sign becomes a signifier in a new signifying transaction, that of connotation. We illustrated this commutation in our earlier discussion of Barthes with the photograph of the black soldier saluting a French flag, a denotative sign which generates the secondary meanings colonialism, nationalism, and militarism. However, Barthes supplements the paradigm, which he appropriates from Jaroslav, in one important respect. He identifies connotation as an agency of ideology, or what he in his early writings calls myth. And this is something that we in our class are calling controlling value. You could call it controlling ideology if you want. You could also call it controlling myth. In other words, Barthes argues that connotation naturalizes history, that it makes a given culture seem eternal and inevitable. It encourages, on the part of the reading, viewing, or listening subject, a constant misrecognition, both of the world and of itself. In short, it reinterpolates the subject into familiar positions which constitute an important part of the larger symbolic matrix. So, for instance, if you are taking a knee as a football player, a person of color, you are calling into place a subject that a bunch of different subjects. One of which is, of course, those that have suffered at the hands of police, for instance, police brutality. But at the same time, other subjects are being called into being, namely those who see the act of taking a knee as an affront against the military, for instance, or against the flag. And so all of these are ideologies that come into conflict with each other in that particular moment of the symbolic moment, the connotations that erupt from the moment of taking a knee. So, in mythologies, Barthes writes that connotation has an imperative, buttonholing character, stemming from an historical concept, directly springing from contingency. It is I whom it has come to seek. It is turned toward me. I am subjected to its intentional force. It summons me to receive its expansive ambiguity. This interpellant speech is at the same time a frozen speech. At the moment of reaching me, it suspends itself, turns away, and assumes the look of generality. It stiffens. It makes itself look neutral and innocent. Like the cinematic apparatuses responsible for the enunciation of film, the voices behind connotation remain anonymous, off stage. In both cases, that anonymity and that representational removal function to conceal the production of meaning, to obscure the operation of discourse. However, the strategies devised by Barthes for foregrounding this surreptitious signifying activity differ from those devised by the theoreticians of suture. Suture, by the way, is how texts are woven together, like sewn together. Okay? Whereas the former focus on editing procedures and a technological complex specific to cinema, Barthes turns his attention to the production of what might be designated a portable meaning, to a signifying phenomenon that occurs in a wide variety of textual systems. Barthes makes clear at the outset of Essed, a book published 13 years after Mythologies, that connotation still implies for him an ideological event. Indeed, he brings the ideological dimensions of connotation into even sharper relief through the emphasis which he there places upon codes. Sz describes connotation as simultaneously the invasion of a text by a code and a digression away from the text toward the larger discursive field. as an incursion that results in an excursion. Connotation is thus an operation which both originates outside of and extends beyond any individual signifying instance. As Barth explains in SZ, a code represents a sort of bridge between texts. Its presence within one text involves a simultaneous reference to all of the other texts in which it appears, and to the cultural reality which it helps to define, that is, to a particular symbolic order. The code is a perspective of quotations, a mirage of structures. We know only its departures and returns, the units which have resulted from it, those we inventory, are themselves always ventures out of the text, the mark, the sign of a virtual digression toward the remainder of a catalog. The kidnapping refers to every kidnapping ever written. They are so many fragments of something that has always been already read, seen, done, experienced. The code is the wake of that already, referring to what has been written, that is, to the book of culture, of life as culture. It makes the text into a prospectus of this book. The codes, which manifest themselves through connotation, function endlessly to repeat what has been written in other books and portrayed in other films, and so to reproduce the existing cultural order. Repetition does the same thing for that order as constant reinterpolation does for the subject. It creates the illusion of stability and continuity. While SZ still distinguishes connotation from denotation, referring to them as different systems, it rejects the chronological model advanced by mythologies. In the later book, that is SZ, Barth abandons the notion that denotation always comes first, and that it has an authenticity and innocence which connotation lacks. Instead, he proposes that denotation is the agency of closure, that it represses the play of meaning by insisting upon true and literal signifieds. In this respect, it can better be understood as producing the last rather than the first meaning. Denotation is not the first meaning, but pretends to be so. Under this illusion, it is ultimately no more than the last of the connotations, the one which seems both to establish and to close the reading. The superior myth by which the text pretends to return to the nature of language, to language as nature. Doesn't a sentence, whatever meaning it releases, subsequent to its utterance, appear to be telling us something simple, literal, primitive, something true, in relation to which all the rest, which comes afterwards on top, is literature? That is why, if we want to go along with the classic text, we must keep denotation, the old deity, watchful, cunning, theatrical, foreordained, to represent the collective innocence of language. SZ draws our attention to the way in which a logocentric semiotics tends to establish the denotative signified as a privileged and authoritative term, one which moreover results in impoverished texts. By the way, so logocentric means focus on the word, on language, on meaning, like a deep meaning or a transcendental meaning or the main idea. And semiotics is sort of a theory of how meaning is shaped in language. So when we say that again, SZ draws our attention to the way in which a logocentric semiotics tends to establish a denotative signified, a meaning, as a privileged and authoritative term, one which moreover results in impoverished texts. So in other words, when we have if there's a meaning that is termed the meaning of a text, it somehow reduces the meaning of the text because there's no chance for any other meanings to be explored. Connotation is there seen as the means whereby that privileged and authoritative term can be contested, and a signifying diversity promoted. Barth tells us, in what is a complete reversal of his earlier position on the matter, that connotation offers us the way into the polysemy of the classic text. Polysemy is many meanings, to that limited plural on which the classic text is based. The rather paradoxical attitude taken by Essed toward connotation can only be understood in the light of Barth's claim that no text is ever reducible to a single code, that even the most classic of texts is the point of convergence for numerous codes. Thus, although every connotation is an ideological event, that event is by no means unchallenged. It is obliged to compete with others which may or may not be congruent with it. Barth defines textuality as a process carried out simultaneously at 5 different levels which intersect at multiple points, and he uses the metaphor of a braid to illustrate their intersection. The grouping of codes as they enter into the work, into the movement of the reading, constitute a braid. Text, fabric, braid, the same thing. Each thread, each code is a voice. These braided or braiding voices form the writing. When it is alone, the voice does no labor, transforms nothing. It expresses. But as soon as the hand intervenes to gather and intertwine the inert threads, there is labor, there is transformation. This is the act of reading. This passage insists on the distinction between expression and production. The first of these is seen as the passive repetition of something which has already been formulated, whereas the second involves an active transformation of existing materials through new combinations of them. It is by means of these new combinations that texts always exceed the sum of their component codes, that they are never entirely predictable. Moreover, the greater the number and diversity of the codes which participate in the production of a given text, the more contradictory and unstable will be its play of signification. Connotation is thus the agency both of ideological consistency and ideological inconsistency. It will serve the first of these goals if only a few codes are activated by a given text, and the second if a wide variety are brought into service. As we noted a moment ago, Barth isolates 5 different kinds of codes or levels of connotation. He refers to these 5 levels of connotation as the semic, the hermeneutic, the proairetic, the symbolic, and the cultural. The semic code functions to define persons and places, while the hermeneutic code is entrusted with the responsibility of articulating and resolving enigmas. The proairetic code establishes fixed sequences of actions, and the symbolic code unresolvable oppositions. The cultural codes, which are extremely numerous and heterogeneous, to a very large degree subsume all the other categories. They speak the familiar truths of the existing social order, repeat what has always been already read, seen, done, experienced. We will return to these codes later in this chapter, but before doing so, we need to confront the interpretive strategy devised by Barth for revealing their presence in classic texts and for maximizing their signifying resources. By the way, what Barth and Silverman call cultural codes, we are calling controlling values in this class. One of the more interesting and important features of this interpretive strategy is that it does not serve merely to reveal and to maximize the codes which operate on the premises of the classic text, but to transform that text into what Barth calls a writerly one. In other words, it not only discloses the symbolic field inhabited by a given novel, poem, or film, making manifest its latent contradictions, but engages the reader or viewer in the production of a different sort of text. SZ defines the writerly text and the reading or viewing relationship which it entails in opposition to the readerly text and the reading or viewing relationship which it promotes. The readerly approach stresses all of the values implicit in the paradigmatic classic text: unity, realism, and transparency, and is therefore virtually synonymous with it. We call this reading mimetically in the class. By means of this approach, the reader or viewer is reduced to an involuntary rehearsal of what has already been culturally written. These two very different sets of relationships with the classic text require a much fuller explanation, but before embarking upon that explanation, I would like to comment briefly on the status of that text. The term classic text refers not so much to any actual text as to the model of the classic text, a model which can only be derived from a process of abstraction from numerous textual instances, much the way that langue, that is language, can only be derived from numerous instances of parole, that is speech acts. Think about also genre. It is important to stress that no actual text ever conforms at all points to the classic model. The actual text always contains a surplus of meaning, signifying elements which are incompatible with the abstract model. It is this excess which makes possible the conversion of the classic text into a writerly text.